So in this video today, I just want to go through how to set up a home pottery studio and how I've done it in particular. This is a relatively new studio. We actually moved into this house about 2.5, 3 months ago, and since the day I moved in, I've started setting up a little home studio. So I started pottery about 2 years ago at a local pottery studio. I had class once a week for about 2.5 hours, and that was how I got to learn the basics of throwing. But after a while, I realized that in order to improve, I need more hours on the wheel practicing. 3 hours a week is just not enough. So I've always wanted to have my own home studio because, one, I can save the cost of renting a space, and two, I can just throw an hour here, half an hour here, and it's just quick and easy, and there's no commute and traveling, and it just encourages me to practice more often. So about 2 months ago, we moved out of the apartment into a 2-bedroom house. The space difference is just crazy. Like, we've got 2 massive bedrooms. We've got a separate dining room, which is where this pottery studio is at now. And having the right space is tough, but personally, I actually don't think you need that much space. This room right now is about 4.5 by 3.5 meters. It's a decent sized room. And for what I'm doing here, it's more than enough. So if this room was just for pottery, I can actually get away with a lot less space. I can put this wheel into the corner and just have a table for wedging and a shelf for drying. And that's about all I need. So even half the size of this room, if I have to, it won't be comfortable. So you don't actually need a big space unless you're producing a huge amount of work where you need drying and kilns and all that stuff, which I'll touch on a bit later. So let's talk equipment. Most importantly, if you want to do throwing, you need one of these, a pottery wheel. I've got a Shimpo Whisper, I think they're called. There's 2 main reasons why I chose this wheel in particular. One, this is the wheel that they had at the studio where I went to class. So it's something that I already know I enjoy and I like, and there's no reason why I should try a different brand or a different model and risk getting something that might annoy me for whatever reason. And two, this is a brushless motor wheel, which means that there's no belt, there's no real noisy mechanical parts, and in the name, it literally says Whisper. It's one of, I think it's supposed to be the quietest wheel there is. I don't know, but it is very quiet. So I'm just going to let this run for a few seconds just to show how quiet it is. You know, this is on a very low speed, and I'm just going to gradually ramp it up. So you can hear a little bit of humming, but it's not intrusive at all. It's not like a belt-driven wheel that's going clank, 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 clank all the time. And that's at full speed. So yeah, you can hear it for sure. It's not completely silent, but having that in the home studio is great, especially if you're sharing a space with other people. It's just so much better. And if you're doing any videos or filming like this, it's so important to have a wheel that's quiet. But that's a very specific requirement for me because I want to document all this stuff. So where I was learning, they use bats in the studio, and that's just how I got used to it. So it was very important to me to make sure that I can use bats at home as well. And personally, the main reason I like using bats is so that I don't have to lift things off the wheel head. And so often when I do that, the shape would change, or especially the thinner it is, the easier it is to warp. So often I'll just throw it on the bat, lift it off. Sometimes I don't even wire it off depending on the shape, because wiring it off actually applies pressure into it and it also warps it. So if I'm really into a very symmetrical and perfect pot, then I'll leave it on the bat and just let it dry. After a while, it just pops off and then you can just trim it as usual. So with the system I got, I use bat pins that are standard 10-inch apart. I drew them in myself. So with the Shimpo wheel heads, they actually have 2 indentations on the bottom where you can just put a drill on it. You don't have to do any measurements because it's perfectly 10-inch apart. So if the bat pin is installed and holes drilled onto your bats, you can simply put it onto the wheel and use it right away, and that's fine. But I find that sometimes it wobbles a bit, especially if the bat gets a bit older. So it was important for me to have something that helps secure it. So what I've got here is, this is a very common thing that you see. It's basically a chamois. It's called a batmate, and you can get this quite readily in most pottery supply shops. And it comes with 2 holes already on it, 10-inch apart, just to match the bat pins. And then you simply put it on, And that's it. It helps secure the bat just to have a little bit of suction from the water. Now, just to go into a bit more detail about this particular bat, this got a hole in it. That's because this allows for a smaller insert into it. The reason why I prefer this than just having a whole bunch of regular size bats is because being in the home studio means that I don't have that much space to work with. And if I have 10, 20 of these lying around with pots on it, it's just going to take up way too much space because they're hard to stack and it's just a nightmare. But with an insert like this, I can just have a whole stack of small bats, plonk it in. And this is actually not that small. This could accommodate most of the pots I make. Unless I'm doing plates, this is not an issue. Rarely will I make a piece where the base is wider than this. Even a big ramen bowl, the foot is still relatively small, even though the rim might be, much bigger. And it's easier to clean because they're smaller, and it's just, for me, this is the most important thing in terms of this whole setup, is because I can just throw, take it off, throw, take it off. It's not just a speed thing, it's also, again, keeping pots on here without having to lift them off, which means there's less touching of the pot when it's wet, and there's less fixing afterward, there's less trimming, and it's great. I can't do without this. So once I had my wheel and bat set up, I already had a whole bunch of throwing tools from when I was still in class. I would bring my own tools because I prefer to do it that way. And I had a field workshop where I got to use and buy a bunch of tools that are very specific that I really enjoy using. So I won't go into too much details about throwing tools and trimming tools, just because there's so many of them, it kind of needs to be a video on its own. But here are just some basic essential ones that I believe everyone should have. A wide tool just to cut clays, very self-explanatory. Sponges, these are great for throwing, cleaning up. You can't have a pottery studio without sponges. That's just, and then just some basic ribs and stuff. And to be honest, if you have some ribs, a wide tool, a sponge, obviously bucket, very important. And if that's all you got, and that's fine. You don't need more than that. If you really want to, all you need are your hands for throwing. You don't need to have ribs and all that stuff, but they do make life easy. And if you want smooth textures, etc., they're very handy to have. But again, that's a separate thing. So trimming tools are slightly different to your throwing tools. They're more for cutting than for pushing. And there's a whole different range of them. There's these little loop tools that are very cheap and easy to buy. Something a little bit nicer. This is a mud tool, which I bought a while ago. It's got a few different shapes and it's quite versatile for trimming, so you can get different curves and all that. I used to use this a little bit more, but then I got something else. Something like this where it has a flat edge. What you prefer is a personal preference. I'm sure everyone's got their opinion on this. And with just a couple of those, that's all you need really to get started. So with equipment out of the way, let's talk about things you need around the studio. So you see at the back, that's my wedging table. It's not great, it's very flimsy. It's just a fold-out table that we had lying around. So for a wedging table, you want something that will absorb moisture because then it releases the clay and it makes it easier to wedge. So what I've done is I bought a piece of drywall repair panel. That way they're a little bit smaller, you don't have to cut it up, and just clamp it onto the table and use that as your wedging surface. It absorbs the moisture very easily and it allows the clay to just release and you can roll it over and over and over. With any clay that I've recycled or bags that are open, I'll just put them in the tub. This is not an airtight one, so for clays that are not wrapped up, it will still dry, but a lot slower. But for bags of clay that are open but still in the plastic, it just adds an extra layer. So it's definitely not for long-term storage, but a week or two is fine. If they're in plastic bags, much longer than that will still be okay, but I tend to use them quite quickly, so it's not a major issue. So one thing that I don't have yet is proper shelving. Right now, you can see all my pots are just either drying or stored on the table, and I had to move them around when I do my wedging and all that. It's a bit annoying. So originally I was going to build my own shelf, but then I just got a bit lazy, and now I'm thinking about looking into buying something, either a cheap IKEA shelf that I can just put up or something that's more industrial, that's on wheels. And that way in the future, if I move into a bigger space, it will be handy to have and I don't have to buy things twice. But most likely I'll just get a simple wooden IKEA shelf and just put it up for storage. And on the topic of shelving, it's nice to have little planks of wood. These are just plywoods I've cut up, and they're great for transporting pieces from one surface to the other. Or you can just have it on your side, and as you throw and just put things on, it just makes life a lot easier. Any production studio you look at, they'll just have like all these boards full of pots lined up, and it looks great. So just nice and easy, very handy, very cheap. So once you've got all your equipment and stuff and you can start making things, you still need a kiln to fire your work. Kiln is probably the hardest thing to do at home, and luckily there's a lot of pottery studios around who rent out their kilns, or they just do community firing, so you can just bring things in, get charged by the weight, and then everything else gets sorted out by the staff there, and that makes it a lot easier. So for me, that's what I do. I just don't have the space for a kiln, and it's also a bit trickier because of the electricals. And the kiln is just the most expensive piece of equipment that you would need in pottery. I think here they charge $10 a kilo firing, so that's almost nothing compared to spending $5, $6, $7, $8,000 on a kiln to start off with. Yeah, so for me that's just more efficient, it makes sense. It's a bit trickier because I have to travel with greenware that's bone dry, which is quite fragile. Luckily it's only about 5 minutes drive away, so it's not a big commute and it makes things a lot easier. So the workflow is a bit tricky because I have to pack it at home, take it to the studio, have it bisque fired, bring it back, glaze it at home, bring it back to the studio and get it glaze fired one last time and then collect it. So it's a bit of a round trip, and that's why I tend to stockpile a bunch of stuff before I get it fired. And it also makes it hard to do tests where I want to just get 1 or 2 pieces fired quickly just to see what the glaze is doing, what the clay is doing. So developing recipes and developing a style is definitely tricky, because as much as I can figure out the form at home, a lot of the firing stuff, it's a long process. It takes a few weeks just to get my pieces finished. That means to develop stuff, I have to wait a few weeks and then do any changes to it and then try a new one. And then it really adds up, where if I have a kiln at home, I can do things within a few days. I can develop a lot faster. But again, it's tricky to do that, and it might be worthwhile one day to buy a small prototype kiln that only fits, a small amount of stuff. Then I do a few pieces at most, but mostly test tiles and test bowls and things like that, and that could be a feasible solution. And you kind of get the best of both worlds, because I can do tests at home and I can do big production runs at the studio, because you can hire a whole kiln to yourself, so you have control over how things are done and the firing and the schedules and things like that. And that's something that I have to look into, but at this stage I can get away with just firing at the studio instead of doing it at home. So let's say now you've got your shiny new toys or your equipment sorted or your studio gear sorted. Now let's talk about maintenance. Pottery is messy. I try my best to throw it as clean as possible, so I don't use much water. I clean my splash pan every time I use it. I mop the floor every time I throw it, and just to make sure I keep it as clean as possible. And that is especially important for a home studio like mine, where it's not a garage. It's literally in the house. My room here is in between the kitchen and the dining room. So there are a couple of things I've done to protect the space, because this is a rental. Firstly, I've put vinyl down in this whole room. So I just measured out the room, went to the hardware store, got a roll of vinyl, lay it down, cut around the corners and edges. Fairly simple, anyone could do it. And it just means that I can protect the timber flooring from moistures and water and clay in general. When you're throwing, there's droplets here and there, and sometimes you miss it as you're cleaning and it gets seeped into the timber and it could cause problem. I don't know if it stains them or not, but I prefer doing it this way. So when the landlord or real estate do inspections, they know that at least I'm respecting the space enough to protect it. And on top of that, I also have a office chair protector. It's you can get it from IKEA or most office supply shops. It's just a clear plastic that perfectly fits under the wheel. And that, again, is just for spillage, and also the wheel's quite heavy, so I wanted to spread the weight a little bit and not just create dents on the flooring. So I prefer to have my clay stored off the floor, that's so that I can just mop underneath it. There's a lot of dust and flakes that comes out of the bags, especially once that's been opened. And the benefit of having vinyl flooring means that I can just mop without worrying too much about the timber. So these are water resistant ones that I've got. So when I mop, I don't have to dry them completely. I can just let it air dry and that's all right. So mopping should be the only way you clean your floor. Any sweeping or vacuuming just stirs up all the dust and it goes into the air. Dust from clays or any powder you use for glaze making, they stay in the air for quite a while before it settles down because they're so fine. And any movement like that stirs it up. And again, if you're doing this at home, you don't want it to spread into the other rooms and everyone's breathing in dust, and it's terrible for you. So any cleaning you do should be with a sponge or a mop. It needs to be wet because it traps all the dust and it doesn't spread it everywhere. So on the topic of dust, I actually have an air purifier that runs 24/7 in the studio, and that just gives me an extra layer of protection, because as much as I try to be clean and wipe any surfaces as much as possible, there are still places I miss, so there's still dust in general, and it just helps clear that little last bit and makes it as safe as possible. And for me, that's an essential item. So lastly, on the topic of maintenance and cleaning, I just want to touch on a clay trap. You can't just dump clay down your sink because it will block up the sink very quickly and it's very expensive to fix, and you don't want to do that. So you can make a clay trap at home pretty easily. I looked online, there was a couple of designs that mainly uses 3 separate buckets. So the idea is, after you throw, for example, you'll have your bucket full of water and slip, and then you just pour into the first bucket, which has the opening at the top where it will just go into the next bucket, and then so on and so on. So by the time it filters through to the third bucket, most of the sediment and clay gets trapped in the first couple of buckets, and then the water just goes straight down. So either run the pipe from the third bucket into your plumbing, or just simply have it go into your sink and then that just goes out. And when the bucket starts to fill up too much, you just let it dry a bit and then just get rid of it. That way the clay are not going into the sink and causing massive plumbing issues. Alternatively, there are systems you can get installed under your sink, and then that just filters all the clay, and then when that gets full, you just take it off, dump it, replace it, and that's fine. But in my experience, I don't want to mess with the plumbing here because, again, it's a rental house and it was a lot cheaper doing the 3 bucket method. So overall, this is my personal setup. Everyone's going to be a bit different. Your space might be different, but I hope that this is a good little guideline of what's possible. If you have a garage, it makes life a lot easier because 1, it's separate from the living space, and 2, you most likely have a larger space in your garage and easy to install shelvings and stuff like that. So for me, my dream home pottery studio would be a separate building out at the back. That way I have control of the constructions and the layout and everything like that. And I can also make it in a way that's easy to clean. But you just have to work with what you've got and don't let limitations stop you from doing what you want to do. So it might seem like a lot of work, and it kind of is, but once you have your workflow and your cleaning schedule and stuff like that set up, it's pretty straightforward. If you set up the bare minimum and then start working on it and adding more things as you go, according to the way you work or your personal style, I think that will be the best approach. So if you've been on the fence on whether you should start a home pottery studio, hopefully this gives you a better idea of what's achievable or what's required. And if you found it helpful, do please subscribe, as this is a brand new channel and every little support helps. So thank you.